It did not arrive on the Mayflower. It was not there when the Declaration of Independence was signed. It was not there at Gettysburg. If you had walked through colonial New England, or the churches of the early Republic, or the camps of the Civil War, you would not have found Pentecostals in the modern sense at all. And yet today, Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity feels almost impossible to avoid. It is in global mega churches and storefront chapels. It is in revival tents and television studios. It is in cathedrals, university fellowships, prayer circles, healing meetings, mission fields, and online ministries. It appears in Africa, Latin America, Asia, Europe, and North America. It shows up among the poor, the middle class, the highly educated, and the socially marginal. Some of it looks intensely emotional. Some of it looks highly organized. Some of it seems anti-intellectual. Some of it is now trying very hard to prove the opposite. In one place, it looks like old frontier revivalism. In another, it looks like a polished global media machine. And somehow all of that belongs, in one way or another, to the same broad family of movements. That is what makes the rise of Pentecostalism so important. Because in one sense, it is genuinely new. It belongs, in its full flowering, to the 20th century. But in another sense, it is not new at all. It grows out of older instincts, older revival patterns, older holiness emphases, older emotional currents in Protestant life that had already been present for generations. So Pentecostalism is both a rupture and a continuation. It feels like something fresh. And yet, when you look closely, you begin to realize that much of its energy was already moving beneath the surface, long before the name itself became famous. And if we want to understand the 20th century church, we have to understand how this happened. We also have to begin with a warning. It is much easier to describe the history of Pentecostalism than it is to define Pentecostalism neatly in the present. That is because once a movement numbers hundreds of millions of people worldwide, it begins to overflow every category you try to force onto it. Some Pentecostals are highly doctrinal and structured. Some are emotionally intense and suspicious of formal theology. Some charismatics remain inside historic denominations. Some reject denominationalism altogether. Some focus on tongues. Some focus more on healing. Some lean toward holiness. Some lean toward prosperity teaching. Some are deeply missionary. Some are almost entirely inward-looking. Some are socially conservative. Some are racially diverse in remarkable ways. Some are now building universities and writing serious theology. Others still embody the older revivalistic suspicion of intellectual life. So when we tell this story, we are not trying to reduce every Pentecostal and every charismatic Christian in the world to one perfect formula. That cannot be done. What we are doing instead is tracing the major historical currents, the impulses, the phases, the key people, and the major shifts that made this movement what it became. The easiest way into that story is through what historians often call the three waves, and perhaps some would say a fourth. The first wave is classic Pentecostalism. The second wave is the charismatic renewal. The third wave is often called the Signs and Wonders movement or neo-charismatic movement. And some scholars now speak of a fourth wave, a more recent effort toward maturity, reflection, institutional depth, and intellectual self-awareness within Pentecostal and charismatic worlds. Now, those labels are useful, but they are not iron cages. They help us describe broad patterns. They do not mean that every person fits perfectly into one slot. Still, the distinction between Pentecostal and charismatic is worth making from the beginning, because many people use the words interchangeably when they are not exactly the same. A Pentecostal, in the more classic historical sense, usually belongs to a church tradition or denomination built directly out of the early 20th century Pentecostal movement. The whole church ethos is shaped by Pentecostal convictions. Worship, theology, expectations around spiritual gifts, testimony, and often even denominational identity all reflect that inheritance. A charismatic, by contrast, may belong to almost any number of other traditions and still embrace practices or emphases associated with Pentecostalism. A charismatic might remain Lutheran, Baptist, Presbyterian, Anglican, Methodist, or Roman Catholic. The structure of church life may remain the same, but certain Pentecostal or charismatic emphases have been added to the life of the believer or the congregation. So the charismatic renewal is broader, more fluid, and often less institutionally uniform than classic Pentecostalism. That difference matters historically. And because the first wave builds new Pentecostal worlds. The second wave carries Pentecostal-style emphases into older church worlds that were not originally Pentecostal at all. Now, before we get to Azusa Street, and before we get to Charles Parham or William J. Seymour, we have to say something even more basic. Pentecostalism did not appear out of nothing. This point is easy to miss because both critics and admirers of Pentecostalism often talk as though it exploded into history from nowhere. Critics sometimes describe it that way because they want it to look unstable, bizarre, and disconnected from the main current of church history. Admirers sometimes describe it that way because they want it to look like a direct, fresh outpouring of the Holy Spirit unmediated by prior developments. But in either case, the deeper historical truth gets lost. The truth is that the Christian world in Britain, and especially in the United States, had already been shaped for generations by revivalism, emotional religion, holiness language, ecstatic experience, and a heightened expectation of direct divine intervention. You can see this in the aftermath of the Great Awakenings. You can see it in frontier revival culture. You can see it in camp meetings. You can see it in Methodist and Baptist expansion. You can see it in holiness movements that stress sanctification, consecration, and a powerful crisis experience of deeper spiritual transformation. In that sense, what later becomes Pentecostalism is not a total break from earlier Protestant life. It is an intensification of some of the most emotionally charged and experientially driven strands already present in American Christianity. Even the ecstatic element has precedence. Go back far enough and you can already find reports of highly emotional worship, bodily reactions, trembling, crying out, unusual utterances, and spiritually charged revival environments. There were also figures in Britain and elsewhere whose ministries contained some of these same intensities. The point is not that all these earlier movements were Pentecostal before the name existed. They were not. The point is that the soil had already been prepared, and that prepared soil matters enormously when we get to the 20th century. One of the earliest important figures in that direct line is Charles Parham. Parham is often called, with some justice, one of the founding fathers of Pentecostalism in its early structured form. He was born in the late 19th century and ministered in a world already shaped by revival and holiness traditions. He preached to the poor, to the spiritually hungry, and to people who believed something had been lost in ordinary church life. He was convinced that the church needed not just correct doctrine, but power. Not just respectability, but the living dynamic force seen in the book of Acts. That focus on Acts is one of the great keys to the whole movement. For most of Christian history, the church had generally read the book of Acts as descriptive. It told the story of what happened in the apostolic age. That did not mean Christians thought Acts was irrelevant, far from it. But they did not usually assume that everything described there had to appear in the same form in every century that followed. Pentecostalism shifted that emphasis. It began reading Acts much more prescriptively. If the early church experienced these signs, these gifts, these manifestations, these outpourings, then why should not the church now expect them again? That question was powerful, and Parham connected it to a second major move, one that would shape Pentecostal theology for generations. He taught that speaking in tongues was the sign of baptism in the Holy Spirit. Now that is a major theological shift. Traditional Christian theology had generally treated the baptism of the Holy Spirit as inseparable from conversion, from being united to Christ, from becoming truly Christian. But Parham distinguished them more sharply. A believer could be converted and then later experience a further empowering, a further crisis, a further blessing, identified with baptism in the Spirit, and evidenced by speaking in tongues. That move would become central. It also created one of the great tensions and vulnerabilities in Pentecostal history. Once Spirit baptism is treated as a later experience marked by tongues, it becomes very easy for some believers to conclude that those without such experiences are somehow spiritually incomplete, inferior, or perhaps not fully Christian in the deepest sense. Not every Pentecostal tradition says this in the same way. But historically, this has been one of the movement's most consistent pressure points. Parham himself was also a deeply complicated figure. He ministered in racially mixed and socially varied settings in ways that could be surprisingly open for his era. Yet he also held disturbing racial ideas, including theories about the origins of white people that reveal how deformed parts of his worldview could be. This too is part of the story. The early Pentecostal movement was not born from spotless heroes. It was born in the real world of American racism, class tension, revivalistic intensity, and theological experimentation. And this brings us to William J. Seymour. If Parham was one of the key early architects, Seymour became the face of the Great Breakthrough. Seymour was the son of former slaves. He suffered from smallpox and lost sight in one eye, a detail cruelly used against him by hostile journalists later on. He studied under Parham for a time and absorbed the developing theology of tongues and spirit baptism. Yet in many ways, Seymour would take the movement somewhere Parham himself could not control. That matters because history often works this way. The teacher begins something, the student carries it into a context that changes everything. Seymour went west to Los Angeles in the year 1906 after being invited to preach. At first, things did not go smoothly. He preached in a local church, but his message caused such controversy that the doors were soon literally shut against him. So the movement moved into a house meeting. Then the crowds grew, the pressure grew. The sense of something extraordinary happening grew. Eventually, the center of this revival became a ramshackle building on Azusa Street. And that is how Azusa Street became legendary. Now here again, we have to be careful. Azusa Street was not the absolute beginning of Pentecostalism in every sense, nor did it emerge from nowhere, but it became the symbol, the flashpoint, the public epicenter, the place where the movement became impossible to ignore. From 1906 to roughly 1915, Azusa Street turned into a global point of attention. People came, they prayed, they spoke in tongues, they cried out, they testified, they worshipped in highly emotional, often intensely unstructured ways. Observers from outside were bewildered. Some mocked it as madness. Others condemned it as spiritual deception. Still others came and were transformed by what they believed they encountered there. One of the most striking features of Azusa Street was racial integration, and in the context of early 20th century America, that was explosive. This was the age of segregation, Jim Crow, and racial boundaries enforced not only socially but often legally and violently. Yet, in Seymour's revival, black and white worshipers mingled, different ethnicities gathered together. The poor and the respectable stood in the same room. Women had unusual visibility in ways that startled many observers. This was not just theologically unconventional in the eyes of critics. It was socially scandalous. That is one reason so much of the media reaction was vicious. Newspapers did not merely object to the theology. Many were enraged by the racial mixture itself. In some cases, it is difficult even now to separate objections to Pentecostalism from objections to black leadership and racial integration. Reporters described Seymour with racist contempt. They described the meetings with social disgust. They often treated the interracial character of the revival as one of the most intolerable features. That tells us something profoundly important. Pentecostalism in its first great outbreak was not only a theology of gifts, it was also, in practice, a challenge to some of the racial assumptions of American Christianity, not perfectly, not consistently, not without contradiction, but really, that first wave of classic Pentecostalism then began producing structures. The revival did not remain one unorganized fire forever. Out of it and out of related currents came denominations and church bodies. The Pentecostal Holiness Church, the Assemblies of God, the Foursquare Movement, the Church of God traditions, and others all rose in the early decades of the 20th century. Pentecostalism began as revival, but it did not stay only revival. It became institutional. And as it institutionalized, one older influence remained visible. Classic Pentecostalism still bore the marks of the holiness tradition, out of which much of it had emerged. It often looked morally strict, visibly conservative, and deeply concerned with sanctification, modesty, separation from worldly excess, and the search for deeper holy living. In some places, this gave Pentecostalism a look not entirely unlike other holiness or fundamentalist bodies, except with a much stronger place for tongues, healing, and immediate supernatural expectation. That was the first wave. Then came the second. What historians call the charismatic renewal began several decades later, especially in the middle of the 20th century. This is where things become both broader and harder to define. In the second wave, Pentecostal-type experiences and emphases begin appearing inside older denominations that had not historically been Pentecostal at all. Episcopal churches, Lutheran churches, Presbyterian churches, Baptist contexts, university fellowships, and eventually Roman Catholic settings all begin showing signs of this renewal. That is why the term charismatic becomes useful. The people in this movement often did not leave their traditions in order to become Pentecostal in the older denominational sense. Instead, they remained where they were and embraced some of the gifts, expectations, practices, and spiritual language associated with Pentecostal experience. In this way, Pentecostalism ceased to be only a separate denominational phenomenon. It began becoming a trans-denominational influence. Examples multiplied. An Episcopal congregation in California experiences speaking in tongues. Campus ministries at elite universities begin reporting charismatic manifestations. Notre Dame becomes a major site of Catholic charismatic renewal. Large conferences emerge, drawing Protestants and Catholics alike. By the 1970s, the language of charismatic renewal is no longer fringe. It is becoming a recognizable force across much of the Christian world. That is a staggering transformation. A movement once mocked in poor, racially mixed revival settings is now spreading through universities, respectable institutions, and major traditions. What had been marginalized was becoming contagious. And then came the third wave. By the 1980s, a newer and more media-driven phase of charismatic life began spreading. This is sometimes called the Signs and Wonders movement or neo-charismatic movement. For many people outside Pentecostal or charismatic churches, this is the version they know best, because it overlaps with mass media ministries, televangelism, global miracle claims, revival conferences, end times excitement, and more spectacular public forms of supernatural expectation. Now here, great caution is needed. It is very easy and very unfair to define the whole Pentecostal and charismatic world by its excesses, scandals, and loudest personalities. Every major Christian tradition has excesses. Every tradition has embarrassing moments. It would be unjust to judge Lutheranism only by its worst parish, or Reformed theology only by its coldest polemicist, or Roman Catholicism only by its corruptest bishop. The same fairness should apply here. Still, the third wave did intensify certain tendencies. One of those tendencies was the increasing identification of miracles, signs, healing, and ecstatic manifestation not merely as possible elements of Christian life, but as marks of true Christian vitality. In some settings, a church without visible supernatural phenomena began to look dry, dead, or spiritually incomplete. In others, spectacular manifestations became almost the expected language of authenticity. This heightened the pressure already present since Parham, the pressure to separate ordinary Christian faith from a more visibly powerful spirit-filled life. This phase also coincided with modern media culture. Television, mass communication, global broadcasting, and celebrity ministry changed everything. Revival was no longer only local, it could be televised. Healing claims could be broadcast. Worship styles could spread internationally. Personal charisma became amplified by technology. The result was a movement that felt larger, louder, more portable, and at times more vulnerable to showmanship than earlier Pentecostal forms. In some circles, this period also intensified apocalyptic and end-time speculation. The Cold War, the fear of global catastrophe, the modern media environment, and the long American history of millenarian expectation all helped create conditions in which predictions about the imminent return of Christ could spread rapidly. Again, none of this came from nowhere. American Christianity had already known repeated waves of apocalyptic expectation, but the third wave gave some of those impulses a new charismatic intensity. And now many historians suggest there may be a fourth wave. This fourth wave is harder to define because we are still living inside it. But one possible feature stands out. Increasingly, many Pentecostal and charismatic Christians are seeking intellectual seriousness, institutional depth, theological maturity, and historical self-awareness. Some universities have emerged. Scholars are writing. Traditions once suspicious of academic theology are now producing their own theologians, historians, and biblical scholars. The old split between head and heart is being challenged from within. That does not mean emotional worship has disappeared. It does not mean Pentecostalism has become something else. It means the movement is growing up in new ways. And that may be one of the most important developments of all. Because if Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity now numbers something like 500 million people worldwide, then its future matters for the whole future of global Christianity. It is no longer a footnote. It is no longer a side current. It is one of the main stories. So what then? Should we finally say about Pentecostalism? We should say first that it is both new and not new. New in its full 20th century flowering, not new in the sense that its roots lie deep in revivalism, holiness preaching, emotional religion, and the search for apostolic vitality. We should say second that it cannot be reduced to one narrow stereotype. It has poor beginnings and global reach. It has black roots and interracial significance. It has anti-establishment instincts and growing institutions. It has ecstatic worship and increasing intellectual ambition. It has both extraordinary missionary energy and very real theological tensions. We should say third that Azusa Street matters because it made visible what could no longer be ignored. Not because it was the absolute beginning of everything, but because it became the point where revival, race, gifts, holiness, power, and the modern world collided in a way that changed church history. And finally, we should say this. Few movements in Christian history have moved so quickly from ridicule to influence, from storefront revival to global presence, from being denounced in newspapers to shaping entire continents, from the margins of American religion to the center of world Christianity. That is why the rise of Pentecostalism is such a staggering story. It is the story of a movement that believed something had been lost, went searching for the fire of Acts, and in doing so became one of the most powerful and unpredictable forces in the modern church.